Welcome back, my plant friends. I am here today with an Alocasia video, and if you've never seen an Alocasia before, I have 3 sitting beside me, so now you've seen them. I think today is going to be more of a relaxed day. It's a Sunday. I'm wearing my sloth socks. My kids like those. I'm going to try and do something that's a little bit more fun, a little more casual, maybe something you've never done before if you're new to Alocasias. I really hope that you enjoy this. Strap in. It should be fun. So today's going to be a video all about Alocasias, specifically Corm hunting, which if you're an Alocasia fan, in the very least, you will find entertaining because corms are one of the ways that Alocasias reproduce, and they are a lot of fun to dig up and replant. So I have a couple of Alocasias back here to repot. I don't know if I'm going to get through all of them, but I should get through at least a couple. They've been sitting in soil for the most part. I think one's in pond for the last little bit. One of them I've had for quite a while sitting in soil, and I personally don't like to keep my Alocasias in soil. I just find it's way too hard to keep track of what's going on. I feel like it's easier to see what's happening with the root system in any other substrate, particularly SEMIHYDRO. I find that I need to get this thing out of there because most of my Alocasias have done really, really well in SEMIHYDRO, and the ones that sit in soil tend to just kind of droop, go dormant in the winter. I just have bad visibility to what's going on, and I'm one of those kind of micromanaging plant parents, and I really need to see what's happening. So I think in the future, maybe Alocasias are going to be a little bit more popular. They've been really growing in popularity the last couple of years now. I think the variegated Alocasias particularly are all over the place now and are starting to become a good collector pickup. If you haven't gotten your hands on one already, the variegated Friedex or the Mycorrhizanas have been around for a really long time. Those have been reasonably popular. I have myself a number of variegated Alocasias, which I think I'll save for a different video because I'm not repotting any of those today. But at the same time, if you're into Alocasias, I have a couple of more interesting ones that maybe you haven't seen, or at least haven't seen too much of, and they might be not necessarily hard to find. I know one of them is actually pretty easy to find, but maybe not as popular as what you'd expect. Like I said, the variegated ones are probably all the rage right now, particularly on Instagram, but if you are a collector of any kind of Alocasias, they're all a lot of fun. And honestly, I think for me, one of the most fun parts of having an Alocasia is digging through the roots for gold. And in this specific case, we're going to be doing that. So I've got my snips. These are sterilized ahead of time. Always, just in case you're new to this, sterilize your tools ahead of time. I use your typical like isopropanol rubbing alcohol. It's enough to clean it off. Just give it a good wipe down, let it dry off, and you're good to go. Just make sure to do that before you snip any plants or between snipping plants in general, so you don't transfer bacteria, etc., from one root system or one stem to another. And that way you're good. You don't have to worry about passing nasty stuff along between your plants. So today what I have for you, I have a couple of plants back here. I'm going to tackle these guys one at a time. I have my tools available. I'm going to show you what I've got here just so you're in the loop on what we're doing. And just for anybody who did not believe me, this is a bucket. Yes, this is a bucket that I actually got in a previous video. If you go and watch that video, you'll see what I'm talking about. My OG, a handful of followers will know where these buckets are from. This is for collecting the stuff that I throw under the table. If you watch previous videos, you probably noticed me tossing stuff under this table. I'm not just throwing it on the floor, it's going into this bucket. So that's one. In the meantime, why don't I show you what I've got tool-wise so you know what we're getting into here. So today I'm just going to walk you through my tools. I'm not usually this organized, but hey, what the hell, I'm recording it, so why not? So what I have here are my snips. These are shears over here. I've got a pair of tweezers. These are rubber-nosed, and they have the bent tip, which I find super handy, and they came in really handy during my tissue culture video. You can go watch that if you haven't seen it before. This guy is a cuticle pusher, which totally is not made for plants. It's made for fingernails, but at the same time, it works really well. And it's got this really sharp tip, which let me see if I can focus on this guy. There you go. Can you see that? Yeah, there we go. And that blunt part is also good for scraping stuff. Finally, I have my potting mat, which I've used in a previous video, and I find really helpful, especially for keeping stuff on this table. I've got some LECA over here, already pre-washed. This is being reused, so it might be a little crusty looking. I've got my great white, which I will talk about a little bit later. I've got a headlamp, which I probably won't need, but it's sometimes handy in these cases, and a couple cups, and you'll see what these are for as we move along here. So I do have some pots, net pots, self-watering pots handy for later too, but I need to take a look at what's going on with these plant roots before I gauge the size of pot that I'm moving into, because not everything is as it seems. So first off, why don't we talk about Alocasias and how they work in general. If you're brand new to Alocasias, they might be a little trickier than some of the plants you've been used to in the past. If you're coming from like a philodendron or Monstera or Scindapsus of Bremnum, all those different aroids out there. Alocasias grow a little differently. They're a rhizomous plant, so I'm just going to pull this guy out because today I'm not really sure if I'm actually going to repot this guy. This is an Alocasia cuprea variegata, which is probably not super obvious from the leaves, but you might see it on this one here. This one actually has a hint of variegation. It's green variegated, pops up on the edge there. There's a couple of leaves. This one also has some of that variegation right there. This variegated Alocasia cuprea also goes by the name Alocasia Red Secret, I want to say. It's been a while since I got my first Alocasia cuprea, and this is actually the first variegated cuprea that I ever had. The variegation is actually starting to dry out a little bit. I've been keeping this guy in a closed container for the last while because he was purchased from somebody else locally, and I wasn't entirely sure he was clean. So I tend to keep all of my new acquisitions isolated for a decent amount of time before I move them anywhere else. At the same time, I had him in there. He was under a grow light inside of a box. You can see he's actually putting on a new leaf right there, which looks great. And he's quite bushy considering he's been in a box. He's already got 5 leaves and pushing out a 6th one. And I've also taken a couple of leaves off the bottom already. This is a good, healthy plant. Like I said, I'm not sure if I'm going to repot this guy today. Just wanted to show you because he's got a little bit more clear view of what's going on in the stem there. I may actually just pop him out of here so you guys can see what I'm talking about. So this guy's currently in pawn right now. He's probably outgrowing this container. This container is really just like a transport container. You know what? I'm probably going to show you what this looks like. So I'm going to ditch this guy out real quick. I'm going to set up my potting mat real fast here. And you can take a look at the roots and then I'll explain a little bit about how alocasias work. First things first, let's dump this guy out. Yeah, let's get all that off. Yeah, the roots are kind of mushy. Actually, they're alright. So this guy's roots are not too terrible, although he's got quite a bit of root rot on the bottom. This container has no holes, so this is a no drainage container, and I've never been a big fan of that. So I'm actually going to separate out the pond here and take some of these dead roots off in the process because there's a decent amount of dead root material there. See that, but there's also a lot of nice green roots, or white roots in this case, that look like they're pretty healthy. While I'm at this, the one thing you want to keep an eye on when you're taking alocasias out of their container is you want to look for corms. And a corm is basically a chunk of the alocasia root system that's kind of overgrown and turned into like a storage mechanism for future growth. So the corm looks like a little round ball. So if you're keeping your alocasias in LECA, for instance, corms are kind of hard to distinguish from whatever else is going on in the root system. In my case here, this guy is in pawn, and this is actually one of the reasons I'm not a huge fan of using pawn with alocasias is that it's pretty tough to get off these tiny roots. A lot of the secondary roots in here, and these are all pretty healthy secondary roots. A little bit of root death is probably not a bad thing, but I mean, for the most part, these are nice. I think in this specific case, he's got a lot of secondary roots that you can see this kind of little root hairs there, and the pawn really gets in there. So I'm going to take this guy out. I'll probably take him off to the sink and give him a wash, but most of the roots are nice and healthy here. And what I'll do is I will also take off any dead root material that I find on here. And if I find any corms, I'll take those off too. Now, this plant looks like it was grown from, I don't know, could be a plug, could be from TC. I don't think this was necessarily a cutting. Could have been from a corm. He's got like this kind of curly cube pigtail kind of root system going on here. To me, when I see these, it's probably that it came from either a corm or from TC. So I'm not entirely sure, but these days, most of your alocasias are coming from TC. So TC being tissue culture. Just taking off some of the dead roots. There's still plenty of roots on here, so I'm absolutely not worried about it. It's in pretty good shape, even though it does have a couple dead bits here and there. I'm just taking off this sheath here. Get some of that off of there too. And I think for the most part, this looks pretty good. So what I will do with this guy is I'm going to repot him into LECA and not pawn. I got started on this guy and now I'm going to have to finish since he's already nude. You know what? Let's just give this guy a rinse off, then you can take a look at the roots.
A few minutes later.
All right, so I'm back. I gave this guy a rinse. You see the roots there. Look, for the most part, pretty good. I think there's a couple little bits I might want to trim off. I'm just going to take a look and see if I should take these guys off or not. Alocasia roots are pretty notorious for being super vigorous. They do get a little meshed up, like you can see here. These are kind of tangled up together, and it's okay to just kind of take those apart. It's also okay to lose a few roots in the process dealing with an alocasia. I have no problem trimming off some of these alocasia roots because they tend to grow back pretty quickly. This guy has already been in like no drainage pond for the neighborhood of a couple months, so he's been sitting there for a bit, and definitely doesn't hurt to transfer him into LECA at this point. The reason I choose LECA for my alocasias is since these root systems are so hardy, and like this is a pretty small plant. Actually, you can see here, there's what looks like a corm forming right here. You can see that little white bud-looking piece on the bottom of the stem here. There's another one over here. It looks like there's a couple of corms forming here. I'm going to look here and I'll see if I can zoom this in for you. So there's the one over here. You can see that kind of dead center of your screen. And there's another one coming. He's kind of down there. Hard to see, but right in the middle there. Just kind of backing onto the first one. And on the roots, I don't necessarily see any on the roots just yet. So if you're unfamiliar with what a corm is basically a chunky storage portion of the rhizome. The rhizome is kind of this tuber section. Now this is probably, I mentioned, from a plug or from TC, so this is not a particularly large example of an alocasia rhizome. There's plenty of bigger ones. Actually, they almost look like potatoes when they're full grown. They're pretty chunky, and actually in a lot of parts of the world, including in your organic food section, you'll see stuff called taro. Taro is actually alocasia tubers that have been boiled, cooked in some certain way where it gets rid of the toxicity. I believe there's some sort of chemical in alocasia roots that is not edible until you've cooked it. I will put the name of that up on the screen if I can find it. It's something you definitely can cook out of it, but you can't eat it raw. Like I said, this is a pretty small example of a root system and definitely a small rhizome, but it does have some corms forming. These are way too small to harvest currently. I wait till they're like probably, let me see this one here. The larger of the two is this guy. So these are both pretty tiny. I would wait until they're about the size of a small pea, thereabouts, and that's a good time to harvest them. After a certain point, they will actually sprout and turn into plants on their own. So this is actually a form of alocasia reproduction by division or creating offsets. So in the case of this guy, he's not ready for me to pluck these corms off. So I'm just going to leave them there and they'll just keep on growing into the new media what I put them into. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to grab my great white, which is Mycorrhizal inoculant. And then I'm going to also grab my pot, which I've got ready to go here, and some rooting hormone, which I don't have ready to go, and I'll grab that. Yeah, so I just realized my messy kid game cupboard was open this whole time, and now I'm like hiding it, so you can't see the mess of kid crap that's in the corner there. What I'm going to do now is, as I transplant this guy, I've got my pot handy for hydro, just so you guys can see. This is a 32-ounce deli container. If you watch my semi-hydroponics gear guide, you'll see that I have a whole bunch of this stuff listed in there, so I will not bore you with it today. I believe this is a 4-inch net cup. Got some handy electrical tape on the sides here so you can grab it. Helps pulling it out after the fact. And I've got a couple of pieces of wicking that I will run through the bottom of the net pot, and I'll just do that right now while I've got these handy. Getting these guys through the holes, always a little bit of a hassle. Just gotta poke it through with something. In this case, I'm using my cuticle pusher to push it through. I push them evenly through both sides. I have 2 strands kind of running through, and then I run this through the LECA. Probably the most annoying thing about these wicking bits is that they tend to shred and fray at the end, so it's just easier to push them through with something. So in this case, I'm just gonna shove it through here with my cuticle pusher. There, that's one part through. Let's do the other half. Alright, so we're good. I've got 2 strands in here. They're kind of evenly separated. Tend to crisscross them at the bottom there, and I pull them up a little bit as I fill with LECA, so I'm going to backfill this guy with some LECA right off the bat. So one thing about LECA, it's always going to drop on you no matter what you try. I want to have a decent layer of LECA at the bottom here. I'm going to pull up on these threads so they're kind of evenly through here. That's one. And the other guy down here somewhere. Typically what I want to do is have these guys drag on the bottom of the container, so I double check that by popping them in there, and they are dragging on the bottom of the container, which is perfect. And on the inside, I just kind of set them up so they tangle through the LECA in kind of a shark mouth, if you want to think of it that way, kind of formation. And then I pop the roots right in the middle. So I'm going to be using my SEMIHYDRO nutrient solution for this guy. Normally what I would do if I were not putting this in the SEMIHYDRO is I'd probably use some dry myco on here directly, and then I would also throw on some rooting hormone onto the roots. In this specific case, since I've already got the rooting hormone mixed into my nutrient solution, this is the Rapid Start from General Hydroponics. I use that guy. It's already mixed, so I don't really need to do anything special there. I will put a little bit of Great White in here. So Great White is a Mycorrhizal inoculant. just actually picked this up recently after using a different brand for an extended period of time. So I'm going to put a little bit of this guy based on their instructions. You can either mix it into your nutrient solution or you can put the roots directly in it. In this case, I'm just going to put the roots directly in there and kind of get a little bit on there. So I just put it into this little container. Curious what it looks like. It's a pretty innocuous looking beigey powder. Pop a bit on there. So the myco should help with growing the hyphae, which are the root hairs. I don't know how to describe them exactly, but basically it's a symbiotic relationship between the mycorrhizal fungus and the root system of the plant, and they trade nutrients and all sorts of fun things, and it just helps the root system grow more effectively. So I think we are good to pop this in. You can see now I'm sitting this guy in. I've got the root system sitting on I've got this about a third filled approximately. Put this kind of in the middle, and I'm just going to fill in my LECA all around it. Now I want this to stand up and I want all the roots to be covered. So right now the roots are running pretty high up the stem. And I've had great experiences with all of my Alocasias in LECA for the most part. Sometimes with the Corms, the little guys tend to prefer smaller particles on their root systems. So LECA and Corms don't necessarily play all that well together, at least for me. But in those cases, I'll use Pon, or I'll use something like Fluval Stratum instead. Stratum, still not sure how to pronounce that.
Stratum.
Same thing with Pon. Even pumice or perlite works great in those cases, as long as you're using a nutrient solution, obviously. Yeah, I think that looks pretty decent. So I'll give this a shake, and I'm going to fill it up with nutrient solution, and I will be right back. All right, so I've got this guy fully potted up now. He's leaning a little bit, but he'll stabilize as his roots kind of grow into the medium. That's the thing with LECA, is particularly with heavier plants, sometimes it takes a little bit to get them to stabilize inside of the container. Got them all set up here. You can see I put my nutrient solution up to about, I want to say about 40, almost 50% of the pot height there. But really what I had here is the root system was actually down to about here. So this is where my LECA base layer was formed here. And then I've got my wicking sitting in the bottom of the container. This is going to wick back up into here, and the LECA will stay moist. And that way this reservoir can stay reasonably full all the time. And I don't have to worry about having my roots sitting in liquid or in water for an extended period of time. And once the plant gets big enough to actually have roots sitting in the water, they typically tend to be water roots, so they're kind of acclimated to that already. And you know what? That's how I grow most of my alocasias. So that'll be the first guy. Alocasias are pretty like humidity-loving plants, so they tend to behave really well in SEMIHYDRO, so I haven't really had any trouble there. I'm going to pop this guy into my grow tent now, since he's been, like I said, sitting in a box for a bit, and I'm hoping that some of that variegation comes back, because right now this is pretty much the tail end of the variegation, and most of the new leaves are unvariegated, so a little disappointing, but you know what? I think with a little bit of time and some new leaves and some more light, hopefully we'll get that back. The other interesting tidbit that if you weren't aware, variegated alocasias, the corms aren't necessarily variegated. I think in a previous video I may have mentioned I have a couple of these jewel alocasias that are variegated. I believe I've got like a variegated green dragon, which is pretty nice. The variegation on that one is super bright yellow, and it produced about 6 corms for me in the last time I repotted it. And out of those corms, I've had, I think 5 of them actually took, and one of them just turned to mush, which happens with the odd corm here and there. The first one that popped out was variegated, which is great. Out of the other ones, I'm still waiting. All 4 of them are starting to sprout now, so I'll show you some B-roll of that if I have it. I'm not entirely sure if any of them are variegated yet, but you know what? It's kind of hit or miss whether they tend to be variegated. So my variegated Alocasia cuprea here is looking pretty good and seems pretty happy in its new surroundings, so I think I'm going to switch gears now to the next man up, as they say on the bench. This guy here, who is nice and large. Let's see if I can give you a nice close-up of that leaf, because it's pretty sweet. This is an Alocasia chantrieri, and I know it's got a new leaf popping, and yes, I am going to repot this even though it's got a new leaf popping for a couple of different reasons, and I'll get into those in a second. You can see here it's actually got a pup at the bottom, which is sitting separately. So just for reference, the Alocasia chantrieri is a described species on its own. I think originally it was a hybrid of Alocasia metallica, which I have never actually seen, and the Alocasia sanderiana. I personally find there's definitely a similarity to the golden bone, although the coloring is completely different. So it's got green stems, but it's got much darker, almost kind of like charcoal. I think the reflection is giving it a bit of a green sheen, but it's kind of like a really, really dark green that goes almost black which is really cool. They come in a little bit lighter colored, but there's a kind of a green hint to it. It's almost alien looking, which is pretty cool. I think it's still in the jewel Alocasia group. That seems to be a pretty arbitrary group as far as I'm concerned. This guy is in an aroid mix, not of my concoction. I've had this dude, and I looked this up earlier just to be sure because it felt like I've had him forever. But I've had this guy for approximately 11 months, just a little bit over now, so it's closing in on a year of having him. He's been in this pretty thick, dense mix because, I mean, I watered it yesterday, and it's pretty wet still. So there's one reason why I want to repot it, is that it's holding on to too much water for my liking. The other reason I want to repot it is because I don't like soil in general in my house, so I want to get into SEMIHYDRO. Other reasons are, A, it's popped in here, which means I want to take this offset out and repot it separately, probably sell it at some point. Otherwise, I also just think that my Alocasias typically do better in SEMIHYDRO in my home, so particularly in my grow tent, they love it in there and they go kind of wild, so I figured, hey, what the hell, let's take advantage. Now, finally, the last reason is because I found some thrips in my grow tent and I sprayed everything down, including this guy. And so far, this guy looks pretty healthy and I don't see any signs of thrips on here. And I really don't want to wait so long that the thrips get bad. So I figured, you know what, let's just get it out of here while I still can. And I'll keep them separate until I know that that thrips outbreak is gone. And after I've got my order from GrowLive in there, which I've got some Orias insidious and a few other funky beneficials coming, I'm going to throw those in the tent and see how they go for the next couple of weeks, and hopefully that clears out any type of thrips outbreak that's going on currently. So I'm a little hazy on the tent right now. I feel like there's some stuff that I don't trust in there right now. So I just wanted to get this out, keep it separate, and repot it while I have the opportunity. This guy, right now, as you can see there's 2 plants in here. There might be more. I haven't found out yet. We're going to dig them up and find out together. So I'll get him into a larger pot. With a plant this size, I'm not entirely sure what kind of pot size I'm going to need. For the smaller guy, I'm probably going to put him into a pretty small container for the time being. I do find that my Alocasias in SEMIHYDRO, the more I size up the container, the more they pup, which is probably just sheer root mass space inside of the LECA. Now, this will be a little bit more fun. Since I'm in soil here, I'm going to be picking through here to try and find the corms. There's even a tag in here. What did this guy say? There you go. So Alocasia chantrieri. It's a French name. I think the guy who originally conceived of this hybrid was named Chantrieri. And if you're French, you probably understood what I said. If you're not French, it's kind of like chantrier in English. So that's where the name comes from. He's kind of crawling up into my face here. I believe there are actually variegated versions of these, but they are like true unicorns, the variegated chantrieri. I have not seen many out there. I don't believe that they're particularly common. I saw one on Monstera X just recently. I think the auction for it closed out. I'm pretty convinced that since I have only seen one of these for sale in my neighborhood, Vancouver, BC, Canada, I've only seen one for sale in my entire time of looking for Alocasias, and I bought it, and now I have 2 of them. And honestly, like, a variegated version of this, I would be shocked. They are out there. But yeah, when it comes to unicorn plants, like, if I could get my paws on a variegated chantrieri, I'd be pretty pumped. Also, my assumption is that this probably came from TC at some point, but who knows? I mean, most of the Alocasias that you see floating around in North America, I'd say that like the vast majority come from TC, and you can kind of see from the roots on that one that I just pulled out, that probably was too. But at the same time, like, you know, you never know. We'll see what the rhizome looks like on this guy, and once we dig him out, we can do some corm hunting. First off, let's take the pot off, and we'll see what kind of root system we're dealing with, and then I'll give you guys a close-up as I hunt for corms. The other thing you can see is I had a couple of sticks in here. This guy was sitting in open air for a long time. I had this on my desk while he was just a 1-leaf Alocasia after I brought him over, and that was kind of my isolation for him, sitting on my desk away from all of my other plants. My desk is in a corner of the room way over there, and most of my other plants are way over here or in my grow tent in the garage, so I felt that was enough isolation for him. But at the same time, he didn't suffer, and he was good in open air, didn't wilt or anything like that, but he did just not get much bigger and didn't size up, didn't grow extra leaves. He was only running 1 leaf at a time on my desk, and now he's got 2, and that's looking awesome, so I'm pretty happy about that. I'm already seeing a little bit of damage on this leaf. I hope this thrips didn't get to it right away. Honestly, thrips are the bane of my existence out of all the pests that I get. And you know, like, Alocasias are prone to spider mites and things like that, but thrips are what get me every time, and like, I see a little bit of potential damage. I'm not sure if that's just from me handling it a little too roughly or just from the leaf unfurling in a kind of squished space because it was underneath a shelf, but it makes me a little concerned. So I will give it another spray down before I reintroduce this to my plants. getting back to the desk thing, the fact that it was sitting on my desk is part of the reason I didn't really do anything with it for a long time. I had it sitting in open air for definitely at least 7 or 8 months. And then I popped it into my tent, and since then, both like this side is popping out a new leaf, and this is the second big leaf that's come off of here. And then this pup has done a lot better. Like he was wilting away, and now he's got 2 nice strong leaves on there. So I think we're in pretty good shape trying to pull him out. So I'm going to take him out of the pot. And I did have these stakes in here just because it was pretty leggy from sitting out on my desk for a decent amount of time. So I'm going to pop this guy out onto my mat, and then I will move the camera over while we do a bit of corm hunting. So I'm just going to squeeze the pot gently. It's still pretty wet from when I watered it yesterday. Hopefully it's not too clumpy in there. Just going to lean it on its side. I'm just going to pull the whole block out. Ooh, wow, the roots look great. So whoever had this before, he had the roots sitting on top of some mesh at the bottom of the pot, which explains why it wasn't leaking soil everywhere. I am not a big fan of this mesh, to be honest. This is some plant mesh. I mean, I don't know if this is metallic or plastic, but you know what? There's a bit of root on there, but nothing too bad. I'm just going to ditch this, and I'll come back to it a bit later. This is pretty wet. Let's get this out of the way. So the root system on here is looking pretty good. I mean, you can see that. It's pretty thickly corded around here, and there's even some kind of root wrapping. It's starting to circle, which typically for me is a sign that it's ready to repot. If you're new to alocasias tend to grow pretty hefty root systems, and then they will pop off of the roots. And these pups start off as what you'll call a corm, which is kind of a little nut kind of shaped thing. It's basically just like a thickened up piece of the rhizome. So a big chunk of root with that's just gathered more energy inside of there. And that will kind of pop up eventually and form a plant. And I mean, you can kind of see here what's going on. This guy was originally root coming from this guy over here. Part of the fun of digging through alocasia root systems is that you can find more of these corms, and they tend to be spread out throughout the soil. So what I do is I typically get the plants out of here and try to pull them apart as best I can. This guy, look at that. He's actually just completely separate. He's got his own root system. And I bet you he'd formed from either a corm or a chunk of the stolon that kind of ran along inside of there. So he's good. He's already ready to blow. So I'm just going to leave him separate. I'm just going to pop him actually over in my original container. Keep him over on the sides. He's got a full-on root system on his own, and I will wash that off, and I will pop that back into his own pot. Now, there's quite a bit there, actually. Pretty lengthy, so he's going to be having to be in a slightly taller pot than I expected. This guy, I just want to get all the dirt off. One thing that you should keep in mind is that the roots are still pretty fragile, even though it's a pretty big plant. And second, like the soil will cling to not only the roots, but to the rhizomes that's in there and to the corms. I'll try and gently tease it apart, but first things first, I'm just going to try and tease these apart as best I can. Oh, look at that. This is a corm. I already got one right here. Corms. This is the most fun way of propagating alocasia in my estimation. This is a corm. But I'm going to put this aside. I'll rinse it off so you can see what it looks like a little better afterwards. So just going to tease the roots out, get rid of some of the dirt here as much as I can, and kind of work my way through this clump. It's pretty wet, unfortunately, so it's like a little hard to work with. At the same time, I'm going to pull off some of the sheaths here, just because they tend to harbor nasty bugs, which is not cool. And also, they're just not needed. They're dead plant material, so just taking it off doesn't hurt. Keeps for a cleaner base of your plant. And also at the same time, there's probably enough spots for aerial roots to pop out under there that releasing this area gives them a little bit more sunlight, oxygen, ability to reach out and continue to propagate the plant. So now it's a nice clean bottom of the plant, and as you can see, there's actually some roots popping out of the rhizome. So this looks like a pretty thick rhizome, actually. Right there, there's already the beginnings of another root popping out there. I'm going to get all this material off. In luck, we got yet another one. There's another corm right there. Half of the fun here is taking the corms off of the root system as they come through. And if you find them popping on the root system and they're big enough, like these guys are right around the right size of a pea. Those guys come off in one shot. You just literally pluck them right off the root system. Now, some of them will pop off automatically, just kind of on their own and start stretching out. Yeah, for me, this soil is way too dense. Like I thought it was actually a bit more chunky aeroid mix, but really it's actually like dirt with some bark in there mixed in, but it's really soil with some pumice mixed together, which is not my style. So I'm gonna clean it up as best we can here. I actually got what looks like another plantlet starting to grow here. I don't know if that's a root or a plantlet. That is kind of hard to tell. Like I said, part of the fun of dealing with alocasias is that they multiply automatically. So if you give them enough space inside of their pot, they're going to do stuff like self-divide like this guy did, where he created a whole new plant in there. The corms coming off the root system will typically eventually turn into another plantlet and start growing out. So they can get very bushy on their own, and you don't really need to make any kind of effort to propagate them. Now, if you're interested in selling them and you have one mother plant, then you have a few different options to divide them, but like naturally speaking, they will divide on their own. The other option is that you can actually stem propagate these guys. Now, unlike like a Monstera, for instance, where you can take kind of a leaf propagation with a node attached to it, this guy, the way they grow is kind of this clumping fashion from the bottom here. So they have one main stem, and this is all petiole coming off of here. So petiole to leaf, and the petiole just binds directly on here. So there's no way to really take a node easily. You pretty much have to chop the stem. So what I've done in the past and what works really well is to just basically cut the stem in half at a certain point where you have roots above and below. So you find the nodes where basically where the roots are popping out, and you just chop kind of halfway along, and you can take the bottom chunk and propagate that by itself. It's not too dissimilar to Anthuriums, and I think I just broke a root off in the sense is that they divide and that they propagate through the stem. But these are rhizomes, so like they do not have the same exact pattern. Anthuriums will offset and pop kind of off of the stem, whereas these guys will typically pop off of roots. I think it's the stolon that runs away from the plant that then generates more, but like it's kind of hard to tell a stolon from a root, to be honest, especially at this kind of size. They're not too far apart size-wise, and they serve vaguely similar purposes, except for like the stolon. They're just under the surface of the soil to basically reproduce the plant elsewhere within the same environment, as opposed to the root system, which doesn't do that. It just spreads out around the plant. So I'm looking, so far I haven't found another corm in here. There's a pretty good chunk at the bottom here. Like this is pretty much all stem, and there's roots all the way along. So technically I could probably chop it around halfway here and propagate the bottom separately. But this plant is putting out a new leaf. He's reasonably healthy. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to let him just be happy in another pot for the time being and accustom him to the SEMIHYDRO. And then at that point, I will probably take some more propagations. Sometimes it's not really worth the effort of propagating these guys by stem because it takes a long time for them to actually start growing once they've been cut in half like that. And like you're going to get natural propagations off these guys through the corms anyways, so I'm not sure if it's really worth the effort of splitting it. Now, if something happens and let's say you break off the top of the plant, or oftentimes if you order these from Southeast Asia, for instance, they will come as just the stump. And it's a little scary to get just a stump at first, but they grow back leaves from the top there. So they'll either grow back from offsets at the bottom or they'll grow from the top that was cut. I've done this, accidentally on purpose a number of times where I'm like, I had thrips and I chopped the entire Alocasia down to that stump. So like right to the base of where the petioles are popping out there. And they have regrown, not missing a beat. Now, sometimes they'll go dormant for a little bit before that happens. And Alocasia is in like a regular kind of household environment. If you don't have them in a grow tent or under grow lights or in warm climates, there's a good chance they're going to go dormant over the winter time. And that's totally normal. So if your Alocasia droops and loses all or most of its leaves over the winter, don't be surprised and don't be afraid. That's like an absolutely normal way of an Alocasia behave indoors. If you give it more of a tropical-like environment and it is sitting inside of a grow tent, for instance, under grow lights and nice humidity, like 60-70% humidity and warm environment that's over 20 degrees Celsius, it's gonna happily pop away for you and keep on growing over that period of time, whether it's winter or not. So it's kind of the conditions you keep it in. If you want to keep it in your house, these are really beautiful, and keeping them in your house, I don't blame you if you want to keep it in your house and keep it in some place that you can see it. For me, inside of my house, I keep most of these inside of either the grow tent or my cabinets, but they can get pretty big. Like this is actually pretty small for a taro or elephant ear plant as far as things go. In the wild, these things can get massive. They can get like a couple of feet wide for some of the leaves. They really, really are gigantic. So in that sense, like I would say, if you want to keep it indoors, if you keep it in a good environment, it'll get big, but it's not going to get monstrous. If you live in someplace warm and tropical, let's say like Florida or Southeast Asia, or in parts of South America, for instance, you're going to get like really killer growth outdoors. And I don't blame you if you want to keep this out in your garden. So really it is kind of up to where you live. I think I've got this mostly clean. I'm going to go rinse this off in the sink and take a look and see if I find any more corms along the stem.
5 minutes later.
All right, so I'm back from washing off the roots on this guy, and I thought I would show you before we dig into the corm hunting a little bit what I can discover in this root mass. So first off, I gave this guy a pretty good washing. I mean, you're always going to have a little bit of soil on here after transferring out of soil, but those roots look very, very healthy. So I am not super concerned about this at all. Second of all, I mean, you're pretty much bound to lose some roots when you're transferring into SEMIHYDRO. It's just kind of unavoidable because these are soil roots and you're basically putting them into water or SEMIHYDRO roots at that point, and it's just going to behave differently. But there are some root buds here that you can see at the very top here that should start growing out nicely into the new substrate, and you'll probably end up with a good chunk of these guys dying off, but a whole bunch of new ones coming out in their place. The other last thing I want to show you before we start digging around is that there are some corms that look like they're forming on here. I didn't find any more while I was cleaning out the roots besides the 2 that I had already pulled out that are over here. These guys are pretty fully formed already. I didn't see any more, but you can see there's a few more that are just starting to pop out. So you guys can take a look at what we're talking about here. But there's at least 2 or 3 on here that are probably things that will become corms at some other time. So I thought I'd just zoom in here and give you guys a good look. So you can see here, this guy here, that brown lump in the middle, that's probably going to become a corm if it does make it all the way through, as is what's sitting next to it over here. Yeah, there's one. So there's a couple of those floating around. They kind of look like lumps coming off of roots, and that is the corm in mid-formation. And that will eventually, I'm just going to put this guy down on the side here, and that will eventually turn into something that looks a bit like this. And this is a corm that I would say is happy to be harvested. It's still got quite a bit of skin on there, which is kind of like this barky material. It's basically just root matter. So I'll take a good zoom here so you can see it a little bit better. So this guy is a pretty well formed corm. It is not popping out of its sheath yet, but it's definitely big enough that it's, you know, it's the size of a good sized pea. For me, this is ready to harvest, and I can plunk this into another substrate. I've got my other baby sitting here, and he's looking pretty good. I just got this in kind of lukewarm water. I'm going to do the same thing, put these guys both in this lukewarm water together. And the intent here is that I just soak off any remaining soil that happens to be sitting on the roots before I transfer it over to LECA. With these both kind of sitting in the water together, and they're both happily in there. All that is just warm tap water just sitting there. That's fine. So for this part, I'm going to point the camera angle down at all this mess down here so you can see what I'm doing digging around. All right, so I hope you guys can see what I'm doing here. You know, if I had a really thick sieve, I could pretty much do the same thing. But so I've got my 2 corms over in a little container here on the side. Keep that out of the way here. And in the meantime, we're going to start digging around here and sifting through this. So I'm just going to look for anything that looks like it might be a corm that might still have some juice left to it. There's some things in here that look like they're just chunks of sphagnum moss. There's a lot of pieces of pumice that are kind of strewn around here as well. So this is a piece of pumice right here. Nothing too special there. What you want to look for is things that are about the size of a pea that have, you know, maybe some barky exterior to them, and that it's not a big chunk of sphagnum, peat, or of bark. So, I mean, while we're doing that, one of the things I really like about Alocasia is just the fun aspect of digging around for the corms in here. And even if I don't find any, I had a couple earlier that looked about right. Is this a corm or is this a piece of pumice? The easiest way to check, because this is a piece of pumice, if you're not entirely sure, just use your fingernail in there. If it scrapes around like a piece of rock, then it's clearly not an Alocasia corm. The fun thing though is that you find these little corms and you can just plant them up and grow another whole plant out of it, and that's just awesome because you really don't have to do a whole lot. It's not like propagating a plant by hand where you gotta chop it, you gotta wait for it to root. There's a lot of effort involved. These guys, you can literally just take the corm off, you drop it into a substrate, cover it up, and let it go. Just pretty fun. So I will show you guys how I plant them up, and then also how I grow them a little bit later. Just gonna fast forward through here. If I find anything, I will stop and pause. So the best way to really feel is to kind of pick it up the soil in your hands, just kind of run it around. If you feel any big lumps in there, just take a look at what you got. There's no real kind of scientific method to this, and there's always a good chance you just don't find anything in here. But I mean, I've already found 2, so I'm feeling pretty good about this. And in this case, like, oh, speak of the devil, right as I said that, there we go. There's a corm right here. You guys see that? This one's a little smaller than the other guys. See, that's the top of the corm right here, where there's the new plant's going to kind of grow at the top there. The new shoot will pop out, and this is where it was connected to the root system. Typically, I plant them this way up in whatever substrate I use. In my case, I'm probably going to use some pon. So let's keep on digging through here. But in 3 is already pretty good for a plant this size. Plus, you know, it's been a while since I potted it up, but this soil is pretty wet, and honestly, like, I'm kind of surprised that these guys aren't rotten. I think a couple of those ones I thought were sphagnum moss were probably just rotten corms to begin with. Just kind of strain it through your fingers until you find anything interesting, those big lumps, and then just take a look at the lump. What does it look like? Does it look like a rock? The one advantage of using LECA for these guys that really stands out, I think pon is similar, but pon I find just a little harder to get off the roots. But with LECA, it's definitely easier to get off the roots, and finding these corms is way simpler. Now, the downside with the corms and LECA is that if you don't get them out early and they grow in the LECA, they can kind of grow a little deformed and squished. But the thing is, if you're using a clear container, you can counteract that by being able to see what's going on. It's a win-win in that case. So stick with the SEMIHYDRO. The combination of having that humidity kind of always available, ambient humidity from being in LECA, and the fact that it's got, you know, a visible root system, you can see how it's doing. It's a little easier for the roots to expand, a little easier for the rhizome to produce corms amongst the gaps in the LECA. There's just a lot of benefits to it. And I think, like, you know, the trade-off of soil, particularly if you're used to soil, it might be a little easier for you. Just find that it can get really clogged in there, and the roots can just kind of get choked up a little bit, and you get a little bit less turnout. I think I've had better experiences in repotting out of LECA than I have repotting out of soil pretty much every time. Now, I'm feeling like there's probably not any more of these in here, but who knows? You know, there's a lot of dirt here, so... And every time I say that, I find something interesting. Like I said, always check the broken off roots, because a lot of times these guys break off because of the weight of them attached to the root. They kind of snap off and just float off into the rest of the soil. One final scan through here. This is where I just kind of break everything up on an easy to see surface and see what I can find. I mean, 3 plantlets out of this is going to be pretty great already. 4, actually, if you count the pup that's already grown pretty big. So, I mean, that tells you right there. That's from sitting in my house in soil in a non-ideal environment for most of the time until I moved it into my tent. The nice thing is that this will keep happening, and now those little corms and those little offsets are going to do their own thing, and they're going to produce their own offsets eventually. So you can either end up with a really, really full pot of your Alocasia, or you can sell them off, propagate them, sell them off, etc. Right? So there's a lot of good stuff going on. It can be tough. Sometimes you might accidentally throw one away, but it's not the end of the world. If I was working with a variegated Alocasia and I threw one away, I'd be a little choked, to be honest, but I think in this scenario, I think I'll be satisfied with what I've got if I don't find any more. 4 pups all told is pretty good. So I'm just gonna pop this into the bucket, so as I scoop through here and sift it, I don't find anything, I'll get rid of it. That way I've got a little less dirt on my table. So it's a bit of a messy kind of task, but it's rewarding. Getting your hands dirty when you're doing any kind of garden work is always kind of fun. It's funny, something when I took up gardening, and you know, I kind of took up gardening reasonably late, like I was over 40 when I started doing this for real. It's one of those things where, you know, I never really liked getting my hands dirty too much with soil. And now since I started, I find it a lot more relaxing and peaceful. So there's definitely a kind of a meditative quality to it, which I think doesn't necessarily get all the credit it should. This is all going to go into the organics bin when I'm done. And the other cool thing about doing this with allocations is every single allocation, if you grow it, you give it room, you haven't repotted it for, you know, 6 months plus, you can go through this process over and over again. And, you know, if you're in SEMIHYDRO, your experience is going to be a lot quicker than this. The soil experience is always a bit of a pain in the ass, to be honest, because it's just a lot harder to find what you're looking for in here. But if you're in SEMIHYDRO, it's pretty easy to separate your substrate from the soil. I tend to just roll it around in my hand like this, and I can feel if there's anything lumpy that feels like it's not supposed to be there. And that is typically your corm. So I do like to do this at least, you know, once every 6 to 12 months. Like when you're repotting, this is a good time to go hunting. And a lot of the times these guys will pup, particularly in the SEMIHYDRO with the nutrients, like they pup pretty fast. And you can see them because they'll start growing in there. Like these guys are not growing yet, but you know, given time, they would have grown off like that first offset I showed you. and eventually would have turned into a pretty large plant in there. So, you know, you're going to either run out of room in the pot or you're going to have a really bushy plant in there. And as long as the plant is happy, it's going to keep on pupping from those offsets. Like I mentioned, even your store-bought Alocasia, you buy it from a big box store, particularly from a big box store, you have some good chances because they're grown from TC and they're going to offset like crazy. The hormones from TC, if they got transplanted earlier on, those hormones stick around for a while, so good chances they're going to keep on reproducing. I think we're in pretty good shape here. We come out of this with 3 corms there, plus the plant lid that I was already getting out of there to begin with. So I now have 5 plants from my original 1 plant, which is pretty awesome. Nice thing about these potting mats, you just give it a wipe down, it's clean, good to go for the next round. And you guys are gonna probably laugh your asses off at me here because I didn't even think to check the bottom of my pot here. So you want to find something that's really hilarious here is look at that. I have yet another corm sitting at the bottom of my pot. There you go. So that would be a total of 4 corms from the plant directly in the soil there, and I'm just checking to make sure I didn't miss any more. No, looking good. Plus the earlier offset, the baby that was already in there, plus the original plant. So that is a grand total of 6 plants from 1 plant, which is spectacular. So let's get rid of this now. And see, always check the bottom of your pots because you never know what you're going to get down there. All right, so how am I going to repot these? So this time around, I'm going to use my usual deli container for the smaller plant, I think. Give him some space to grow in there. Also, just because he's got a taller root system, I think having that, I've pre-cut my wick this time around, but having the vertical height in here in this larger container makes sense. And I've got one of my newer self-watering pots that has a water level window down here. I did cut some wicking for this guy, but it does come with wicking. I just wasn't a big fan of the wicking that it came with. It was pretty narrow and skinny and also cut awkwardly, so I think my wicking will do a better job, so I'll pop that in there. You can see the basket is quite deep on here. This is like a 5+ inch basket on here, so a little more than a cube in terms of how it's shaped there. Square pot, it's got more vertical height. I figured the root system, it'll fit that tuber a little bit better. You want to get most of the roots, if not all of the roots and the nodes that are going to produce roots into the LECA. So for these types of plants, like for Anthuriums and for Alocasias, I think using the taller containers makes a lot of sense. This water level indicator just shows you what's at the bottom, like below the level of this net pot. It's not even a net pot really, it's sort of a net pot. It does have a little watering spot here. I've never tried these guys, these are new to me. I usually use ones that have actual netting a bit more. But you know what? I figured give it a shot. It's big enough to hold these guys, and if this works out well, then I can keep on using them for Alocasias and probably for Anthuriums. So I'm just going to hook these guys up and I'll pot them both up at the same time. There's nothing different from how I'm potting these to the previous Alocasia cuprea, so the variegata back here. So I'm just going to do it the same way, and I will kind of zoom through this so you guys don't have to wait it out. I can kind of look through the holes here and I can see how far deep my wicking is going. Probably could have made these a little bit longer, but you know what? I think it'll be fine. So I ended up cutting 2 slightly longer strands of wicking. This is kind of like in the, I don't know, 13, 14 inch range, just because they weren't quite sticking out far enough into the pot for my liking. So this will work a little bit better. So I'll go with the shorter one first, tuck that in there, and then I'll put the long one over top of it. Just using the holes that are already in here to get this going. So as it turns out, there are only 2 big holes in here. So you know what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut a piece of the thinner wicking I have, which is I think 1/6 of an inch, and run that with this 1/4 inch, one of each, because I don't really feel like trying to squeeze this through these tiny holes. So that's flaw number 1 with this pot, is that the hole diameter, it only has 2 big holes and the rest of them are kind of skinny. So I've got 2 different thicknesses of wicking here. I'm just going to use one in the big holes, one in the small holes. Let's fill her up with the LECA. This guy's going to take a decent amount more LECA than the previous one. Do a base layer in here. Always kind of measure out how big your plant is. You want to make sure that you have a bit of clearance at the bottom for the root system, but you also want the whole thing stem-wise that can grow roots to be properly buried. Just gonna take this guy out. He's already wet, so I'm just gonna leave him wet. In this case now I'm gonna put a little bit of the myco on here again and just roll it around in here a bit. So this stuff is pretty expensive, so you don't really want to waste it. So it's kind of like get as much as you can on there. I'll try and use all of it. You just want to kind of coat the roots as best you can. It's easier to do this when they're wet. You can also mix this into the nutrient solution. I just haven't done it yet, but you can make a solution out of it. And it does, the Great White at least, is water soluble versus some other brands which are not. So if you're buying this myco and you use SEMIHYDRO, make sure to buy a brand that actually works with SEMIHYDRO and is cool to be water soluble and mixed into your nutrient solution, or at least mixed into water so you can kind of mix it into the nutrient solution. So this looks pretty good. Height wise, I'm kind of just topping out there. So I'm actually going to make a little bit of a divot in the rocks at the bottom, give it some clearance, and kind of bury this dude in there. I want the roots to be taking up as much space as they can around. Okay, that looks pretty good. It's pretty well seated in there. Now I'm just going to fill around it. Make sure you position it in a way you're kind of comfortable. Like right now I'm looking at this and the water feeder is on the other side. Probably want this in the front, so I'm actually going to turn this plant around. And that way the little feeder zone there is on the front. I can reach it and it still looks nice. I don't have to turn the plant around every time. The other thing is that as this plant matures and grows, the stem is going to keep on growing, and more of these nodes where it grows roots are going to keep on popping up and up and up and up. And you will end up with a plant that's sticking out of the soil with a whole pile of root growth at the bottom. So in those scenarios, you're going to want to repot. But for now, I'm in good shape here. It gives me about an inch below the threshold here, maybe a little less before the top roots. And my nodes that are sticking out there, with the little root nubbins coming out, should be covered. So I'm just going to backfill this a bit more with LECA. The nice thing about LECA is that you can reuse it a million times over, and it really doesn't degrade a whole lot. These pots are great for SEMIHYDRO as long as you've got the wicking in there, and you can fill them up and you're ready to go to town. So this is looking pretty good already. I'm pretty happy with this. There you go. There's my nicely potted up Alocasia chantrieri. Again, with LECA, it does tend to settle a little bit after you've filled it up, so you're probably going to want to kind of give it a little bit of a tap to settle around the roots, and then backfill a bit more in there. Oops. Always a LECA drop. If you guys watch Kevin at Hakuna Planta, he has some pretty awesome alocasias too, including his golden bone, which was the inspiration for me picking up an alocasia golden bone. He has always got this hilarious LECA drop moment in pretty much every video he puts out that for some reason I can't not laugh at every time. It's so predictable, yet it always happens. It's a good shtick he's got going on over there. The safety of having a potting mat is that LECA drops don't happen too often. So there we go, fully potted up. This guy looks pretty happy. I'm going to give him a little bit of nutrient solution, and I'm going to work on his child over there. Pro tip for anybody who has never used LECA before, or if you're new to using LECA, just make sure to rinse it off someplace like outside the first time around, because the amount of dust that comes off of there, it can turn into sediment and clog up your drains, particularly in your household drains. So you want to make sure that if you're using your LECA for the very first time, taking it out of the bag, etc., that you want to make sure that you clean it in a place where it's not going to get into your household drainage. This is, LECA that I've purchased and rewashed, etc., multiple times over, so it's not really losing that much of its dust. But first time around, definitely get your hose out and wash it outside. So I'm going to quickly pot this little guy up here. It's no different than the very first one that I potted back up over here, so I'll get this guy out of the way and pot it up now. There we go, Alocasia chantrieri number 2. I do have this guy back here filled up in his pot. I've filled up the water same way to about just above the base of the inner pot. And just so that the roots are not sitting in water, but they're sitting in moistened LECA. And also, as I'm filling these up, I'm making sure to run the water through the LECA first, because it's just a good way to kind of transition them over the first time around. I expect a bit of root loss, to be honest. Like, there's probably going to be some root loss, but at the end of the day, they're going to grow in your roots pretty quickly, particularly with the rooting hormone that's mixed into my nutrient solution. So last thing that I never want to forget is my label. So I'm going to pop a label on there for my awesome Foamemo, I don't know how you pronounce this, Foamemo label printer that I am totally not sponsored by, but I would absolutely be sponsored by these guys because the thing is so good. So I'm going to use this, print off a label here. There we go. The joy of this. I printed 3 labels in one shot. So nice. Okay, turn this guy off. Get him out of the way. 3, read him 3 labels that I hope I have the right way up right now. Pop one of these guys on here. This guy looking good. A little crooked today because I printed without checking first, but it is labeled. Look at that. So this guy looks really nice in here. I've got him in his nutrient solution. He's all labeled up. He has got his roots all covered by LECA. He's got the water level sitting kind of right below the bottom of the root system, and hopefully he will acclimate to the LECA reasonably quickly. So last but not least, you probably noticed this leggy ass mofo sitting on the side here that I am so sick of looking at. This is an Alocasia lukiwan. This was dirt cheap. That is from North Shore Tropicals. I got this for all of $5 Canadian, which is like $1.50 American. No, it's not, but it's still pretty cheap. So the problem I have with this guy is that he is so leggy because he's been kept in pretty low light. Also, he's fallen at least 2 or 3 times, and he's just popping out these like 1.5 foot long petioles, which I really need to do something about. I'm tempted to just chop him right down to the rhizome, but we'll see. I might just let him naturally do that. He's fallen multiple times in my storage closet where I've been keeping him that has a single light source, but I wanted to keep him isolated. You know, when you're buying plants from garden centers and from boutique plant shops like North Shore Tropicals, but like I tend to just be really wary about introducing them into the rest of my collection. So this guy, he's going to go into the rest of my collection. He's also going to move out of this crap soil that he's in. This is like a plug clearly that's been in this. This is like some sort of mush topsoil combined with I don't know what. But yeah, it's definitely time to take him out. He's so loose in here that he's probably just going to pop out anyways. But I figured since we're looking for corms, I will do a quick little corm hunt in this one. And since I showed you what I did last time, I don't think we need to do it again. But I'm going to quickly fast forward through digging through the corms here because he's root bound like crazy and he popped right out of there pretty easily. You can see that the roots are circling the container. That is some root bound. So I'm just going to give this guy, tease what I can soil wise off of here. Oh, well, it's just popping right off. I'll give it a dig through the soil, see what I can find. The reason I went for the Alocasia lukiwan is because of its mature size. The mature plant looks really great. I mean, I think it looks kind of unimpressive right now as an immature plant. You can see there, I don't know if that leaf is turning out okay. Looks all right, but I mean, if this is a jewel Alocasia, it's on the definitely much larger side than I would have expected. I'm hoping I can grow this to be a bit more compact with higher light in my tent and better conditions and just a closer light source. And you know what? If for some reason this guy does not take well to my tent, I will sell him because he cost me barely anything in the first place. He is loose like crazy in here. Very soggy. Another reason I'm just not a fan of the soil. It's hard to tell how much it's retaining moisture in a home environment. I'm trying to tease these roots that are totally circling around the bottom, and they're pretty white, which is nice. I'm trying to tease them out a little bit without tearing them apart. I feel like there's a Tommy Wiseau joke in here somewhere. Lisa, you're tearing me apart. Oh, this is so much dirt. It's just clogged in there. This guy is 100% going to need a good root washing. He is particularly unstable, and there's not a whole lot below the original plug in here. There's not a very long root system at all. I think it's mostly roots just popping right off of what you can see here. This is pretty much where they're all coming from. So I'll be happy to get him into something where he can grow a bit taller of a stem without just being roots. The other thing about the soil being so compacted around this root system is that I don't know where the corms would grow in here. Oh, there's one. Speak of the devil. Seems like every time I say I don't think I'm going to find a corm, I find a corm. That's the second time, maybe even third time now. There we go. That's one. Now, reselling the lukiwan is going to be not much of a profitable experience, but at least I can make it bush out. Maybe I'll pop these all into the same container. Considering that they sell for $5, I'm definitely not going to get much for these ones. Whereas the chantrieri there, that guy, I can pretty much sell each one of those corms for a decent amount and easily make back what I bought it for and more. I think for the rest of this, I'm going to go rinse it out in the sink, and I'll be back with a clean set of roots. So I am just going to let this dude soak over here in the warm water like I did with the first one or the second one, just so that I can dig around and see if I can find any more corms. Now, I do have this one, which looks pretty decent, so I'm going to put this aside. I have yet another of my little containers here. He's got a pretty long root coming off of him. You probably can't tell from where he is over there, but I did lose one leaf in the process from the bottom. I probably could lose a second one. just because it looked like they've been damaged a little bit, and it's going to grow back anyways, so not too worried about it. So I'm just going to quickly sort through this, and if I find anything, I'll let you know. It's amazing how much soil there is in a tightly packed container. It looks like there's twice as much as when I took it out in the first place. So not nearly as much luck with this one so far, although that was a much less mature plant. It definitely was coming from a plug. So it does have, and I'll show you the bottom of the stem that's there, what looks like probably another couple of corms coming, but I'm not really surprised at this point that it's only got the one that I found that was ready to go. I'm assuming that corm is from this plant. And you know, when you get these alocasias from nurseries, this is what you're going to find. It's like, it's really densely wet, tightly packed soil. And I know this came from boutique plant shop, but it's definitely formatted the same way. And I'm pretty sure this probably was bought from the same vendor that you find in the big box plant shops. So far, no dice, not finding anything else here, just the one. Always double check. You don't want to be throwing away perfectly good corms if you don't have to, but you're not always going to find the buried treasure, but in this case the one is good, and I know there's more coming if you look at that plant. Now the nice thing here is that to moving this plant into SEMIHYDRO, it's going to have a lot more space to breathe. Definitely getting it out of soil is going to help, and the nutrients that it's getting is going to beat whatever it's been sitting into this dirt, and it's absolutely going to have more of an opportunity to pop in the future, so that should be good. Yep, so just the one corm in this guy. And like I mentioned, it does have another one on the way, at least one, if not more, which I'll show you momentarily. So let's get this cleaned up, and I'll come back and we'll pot them up, and then we'll pot up the corms. I'm ready to go here for this last little bit. I've got my corms soaking in warm water here, and this is just to kind of get them ready to go into the substrate, but also if you want to, you could use that time to peel off any of the kind of barky root substance that's on there. It's like that root surface material. You can peel that off if you want to. Some people do, some people don't. You can use this dab tool scraper thing. Both ends of it are pretty good for that. This is the sharp end, this is the dull end. You can use that and kind of scrape at the corm if you want. I find that letting them sit in something like pond for a couple days to a week or two, usually enough to either get them to open up on their own if they're big enough, or that kind of brown barky bit, that will peel off on its own. You can also just help it out if you want. And eventually what they'll look like is this lukiwan corm doesn't really have much of that barky type of exterior on it. It seems to be mostly clean. So this one's pretty good to go. I think I'll probably trim off the bottom of that root. You don't really need the whole thing. And then pop that in there. But yeah, I let them soak for a little bit before I end up using them. So I've got a bit of pond ready to go for these guys. So I'm just going to pot this guy up while we've got him here. As leggy as he is, I would be happy to see him grow something more like this guy here. This shorter leaf is looking really nice, but all of the newer leaves are huge, and I think this one's probably about to go. You can see alocasia leaves, they're pretty indicative of when they're going to die. You can see there it's already starting to brown off at the end, and that's not from light burn or any kind of damage. That's just like it's going to go pretty soon. I think I might help it out and just take it off right now. It's an outer leaf anyhow. There. Simpler that way. It was going to die anyway, so let's get it out of the way. A little simpler to clean that up now. That last little bit will just die off on its own. And now we're down to a slightly less troublesome size. Alright, roots are good. Not too dirty. Most of the dirt's off. There's a little bit of bark on there. And I'm going to put a little bit of myco on here while I'm at it. This is just the bottom of what I had. Just going to roll it around in there a bit. And you know what? I'll save the last little bit of myco for the corms. But I mean, without actual roots present, I don't think it's going to do much of anything. But it's already out of the container, so I might as well use it for something. I've already got my net pot ready to go here, so I'm going to throw a little bit of LECA in here. This guy has very little actual stem material, but you can see down here there's the beginnings of what look like a couple more corms. I don't think those are proper roots. I think these are corms popping out. A little tough to see, but there's a couple of these that are kind of peeking out, and they look like these are going to form into the stolons that pop out with the corms on the end. So let's get this guy potted up real quick. Now, I am using a smaller container for this guy, even though he's a reasonably large plant, just because the root system is pretty small and compact, and he doesn't have a whole lot of stem to him to begin with. So okay, good, nice and even at the bottom. Okay, I think that's probably good. And I'll pop this guy inside his roots. I just tuck them inside. And I'm going to backfill this. And that's it for my LECA today. These guys, I don't mind burying the base of the plant in the LECA too much. As long as I don't run the water level up that high, I should be okay. He's already got some roots kind of peeking out through the net pot here. Now, he's not going to hold up on his own particularly. So he's going to need a little bit of help. Might need to put a support on this guy until his roots tighten up a bit. But sometimes these guys can be a little floppy at first, but once they start rooting in, they will solidify into the LECA, and then they'll be hard as nails. And I know this for a fact because my Alocasia watsoniana in my grow tent dropped off a third shelf, good 2.5 feet off the ground, and landed on the ground and did not even fall out of its pot. It was that well rooted that LECA fell out, but the plant itself was rooted solid in there. And it was just kind of sitting there with half of its LECA knocked out, which is pretty funny. The plant itself survived just fine, so I didn't even need to repot it. I just put the LECA back in, and that was that. So there we go. I think this guy's good to go, and I'm going to fill him in with my nutrient solution here. Well, these OXO squeeze bottles are super awesome for everything. I'm just going to make sure I run it over top of the LECA, about 1 centimeter or so above the base of the plant. And you can see here I've already got some roots kind of starting to stick out there just from the way they were potted up. Those are all above the water level, which is good. And this will just wick up through capillary action. And these guys will be good. I'll show you a picture of a mature one because the mature lukiwan looks really cool. And that's the reason I got it. And especially at the price, you can't really go wrong with a $5 plant. And considering it's growing pretty well in not the greatest conditions in my home, I can definitely put it into better conditions. I would say that it's going to do much better in an even better environment. So last thing up here is I'm going to pot up these corms, and then I'm going to label them because otherwise I'm going to not be able to keep track of what they are. So easy peasy here. I've got a 12-ounce plastic drink container. This one's got a hole in the lid here to pop a straw through, but I mean, you lose a little bit of humidity through there, but it's almost as if the thing were closed. And then I've got this 9-ounce parfait cup, which I like to use these guys for kind of single plants that grow a little bit taller while they're still in super high 100% humidity. So I use that for some of my TC plantlets as well. I'm just going to pop the lukiwan in here, and all 4 of these corms I'm going to pop from the chantrieri into this guy here. And eventually, as they start popping and they actually start growing, you know, like what we'll get here is out of the tip here, you're going to start getting leaves popping out of there, and it'll be a new growth point for the plant. This is pre-rinsed pond that I've got here. It's given enough room to grow some roots, but something with alocasias that you got to keep in mind is that you want to make sure that they have a decent amount of headroom inside your container because they tend to grow tall and leggy when they're inside these containers to start off. So until the plant is a little bit more established, and then I'll move them all into individual containers. So I'm just going to pop these guys in here one at a time, and then I will add a little bit of nutrient solution too because these are just sitting in water currently. So I'll pop these guys in, and then I will surround them a little bit more with a bit more pon, just kind of over the top of the base of the corms. I'm just kind of evenly spreading these out amongst here. And you can always tell a corm, like the bottom end of the corm, if it's kind of torn off, this is the root end. It looks a bit like a stick coming out of there. This is what it looks like when it's got the full root end attached. And then this is the bud end at the top here where the new plant will form. It's going to bust out of this barky type stuff and it will create a whole new plantlet. And I'll show you a bit of B-roll of some more advanced corms that I've got from my green dragon variegata. And that way you guys can see what I'm talking about. So as long as the base of the corm is sitting in a moist substrate, then you're in pretty good shape. And don't worry too much if that root part breaks off because it's not really needed. The corm will form roots at the bottom. So basically the base of the corm here, like where it's connected to the old root system, this will form roots from about the halfway point down. Will start forming roots around the edge, kind of like a little wispy beard. And then the new plant will pop out the top here. Just be patient. These can take anywhere from like a couple of weeks to pop open if they have no bark on them, like this one here, all the way up to a couple months for the barky ones. Like I've got a couple from my other plant where I never scraped off the outer bark and they took a good 2-3 months in like 100% humidity sitting in pretty damp LECA. I would say just be patient. I keep them on a heat mat. That's my thing. These guys always keep them on a heat mat. You don't have to do that. I just make sure there's water kind of sitting at the bottom here. I don't want them too soaking wet, but I want enough water in there that they stay humid all the time. Okay, we definitely don't want it to be like flooded. I've got the water level to kind of around here-ish in there, if you can see that okay. And then I've got all 4 corms sitting at the bottom. in a square. No biggie. Put a little bit more pon just to kind of cover the base of the corms, especially the ones that are a little bit more unstable because they don't have a tail on them. What you don't want is so much water that it's really kind of overflowing. So I've got the water level somewhere around here. It's well below the corms, so that's good. So I'll cover it off, I'll label it, and I'll put that aside. So that's number 1 with the 4. Then I'll do the same thing over here. I'm going to put another base layer. This guy's got quite a long tail on him, and I think I'm going to take off part of that tail because it's kind of like not necessary. So I'm going to snip the bottom bit here off. And you know, I completely forgot about the myco on the other ones, but honestly, I don't know that myco is going to do a whole lot on a corm, but who knows? Not going to hurt. So there's my experiment. I'm putting some myco on this guy, the lukiwan that I don't care about, and then with the other ones, I will leave it out. So this guy's got still a decent amount of stem on him. I'm kind of popping him in there. You can see he's sticking out a bit. So I'm going to backfill that with some pon all the way around until he's basically just kind of sitting pretty right in the middle there. So he's happy in there. I'm gonna give him a bit of water too, maybe not quite as much as the other one. So make sure all the pon is moistened and that it's got a teeny bit of a reservoir. You can technically get away with probably just moistening the pon and leaving it as is, but I like to leave a little bit extra in there because with the humidity, evaporation on top of the heat mats and everything, it tends to kind of evaporate, condense. There we go. So he's popped into there. Looks nice and happy. And we're all done. So there you go. Repotted 4 plants. And I've got an extra 5 corms here. So we're in pretty good shape considering I started with 3 plants. But this is the fun of alocasias. I hope you found this entertaining. I hope this inspires you to go and find your own alocasias. Even the non-variegated leaf here looks pretty sweet. I gotta say, look at that guy in the light. Isn't that nice? Variegation here, I really hope this pops back up. We'll see. Feel free to let me know in the comments if you do something different with yours or if you have a completely different variegated alocasia that's your pride and joy. I have a couple more coming in my next TC order that I'm looking forward to. And, you know, if I make any progress on these, I'll be sure to post a follow-up on these guys and let you know how they're doing. So thanks for joining me on this Alocasia treasure hunt. I am Nick from Proppist. If you enjoyed this kind of content and want to see more of it, please do drop a like and subscribe. You can hit the bell icon for notifications. The more subscriptions I see, the more people will like my content, the more I will produce for you. So I really hope that this is helpful, useful content for you. Hope you learned something today, and if you didn't learn something, I hope you were at least entertained by the treasure hunt. And I hope you go back to your alocasias and do a little bit of repotting, and hopefully you'll find something too. So again, I'm Nick with Proppist signing off. I'll see you in the next one.